So I was watching the BBC, and they were interviewing one of the Ukrainian soldiers who had been part of the group that went into formerly occupied villages that the Russian soldiers had occupied. And it was that one which I think most of you have seen with all the bodies of people in the streets, citizens that had been killed and slaughtered and abused by the invading army. And the BBC interviewer was interviewing this soldier and said to the soldier, in the sight of this terrible injustice, said to the soldier, "How do you feel about the Russians?" And the soldier, who spoke English, said with some real anger in his voice, "I hate them," he said. "I hate the Russians, and I'll never forgive them for what they've done to my people." And he said, "I've got family in Russia. They are no longer my family. They are no longer my family." And in the background, you see the bodies of the people in the street. And this this Ukrainian saying of the Russians how much he hates them. That is not shocking. In the face of such injustice, that would be the expected response. That would be what you would expect someone to say when they have seen their fellow countrymen, perhaps even relatives, killed in such a way. And yet, we are here on Good Friday to consider the greatest injustice of them all, the one true innocent who is cruelly flogged and humiliated and mocked and tortured and killed in the most brutal of ways. And yet, that one true innocent is concerned not for revenge or for hate, but is concerned only with forgiveness. Forgiveness is at the very heart of Good Friday, as I'm sure you should know if you're familiar with Good Friday. At the very heart of Jesus' death on the cross is forgiveness. And it is in Luke that we find this well-known episode of the forgiveness given to the thief on the cross. And I want to pick up on those verses and three things briefly that I want us to take home today. Three things about forgiveness that I want us to take home from this passage from verse 32. First of all, I want you to see this picture of forgiveness being offered, forgiveness offered. I think most of you know well enough the events of Good Friday, and we know well enough that Good Friday didn't happen in a religious setting, some sterile cathedral, or some ornate procession with gold crosses and candles. The crucifixion was a brutal event, cruel, messy, noisy, humiliating, incredible torture that the criminals would endure, being flogged and then nailed to a cross. And it was always done in a very public place, and the executed criminals were always stripped naked, beaten and bloody and humiliated. And it was done purposefully like that by the Roman Empire, so that all people would see and fear crossing the mighty Roman Empire. Historic records tell us that sometimes dozens of people would be executed at the same time in a very public place as a warning to the occupied nation. On this day, there were three that were executed from verse 32. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, it's described like that because of the way that mountain looked, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Crucifixion is a real form of execution. When I was in Jerusalem, I went to the Jerusalem Museum and saw some of the excavated bones of someone who had been crucified, and they were on display in one of the chambers. And you can actually see through the ankle bones, the nail, the rusty nail still there, gone through the ankle bones. what they would do was they would nail the forearms to the one beam and then put the two legs together and nail the other nail through the ankles into the bottom beam. Some criminals would get a little wooden a stake that was in the cross where they could sit on it, or almost kind of sit on it. That wasn't a kindness, actually. That would prolong death. That would prolong death because it would hold you up a bit more to stop you from suffocating, because that's what would happen. You couldn't hold yourself up on your arms anymore and you would suffocate to death. It was a terrible thing to be done. I was actually thinking this morning that if citizens of Israel, Palestine, the Roman Empire in that day, came into our church service this morning and saw the kids singing, "He died upon the cross," I think they'd be terribly disturbed by it, because it wasn't children. It wasn't the stuff of children's songs in those days. It was the stuff of shame. Roman citizens said it would be. It was a unmentionable thing. It was not the kind of thing you brought up at polite dinner conversation. You wouldn't bring that up at a conversation like we say. You don't talk about religion or politics or something. It's the secular mantra these days. In those days, you didn't talk about crucifixion. You certainly didn't bring in your children for entertainment just before dessert and get them to sing about it. And that would have seemed very strange for them, for us to be talking about it in that way. So, these three men executed on the cross, being nailed in this brutal way, three beaten, naked men, nailed while still alive to beams of wood. In the midst of that cruel moment, in that terrible moment, Jesus says these unbelievable words in verse 34. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. In the moment when you would least expect it from a human point of view, you would have expected the words of that Ukrainian soldier, rather. But instead, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them," the very ones who are cruelly nailing him to the cross, stripping him naked and gambling for his clothes. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." This is the first of the so-called 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. It's an annual favorite sermon, particularly at our Easter conventions. Every Easter convention in many of our churches around the country, the sermon is always the same, the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. This first sentence is perhaps the most uncomfortable, and is really should be causing everybody who reads this, who understands what crucifixion is like, to be saying, how could Jesus ask God to forgive the very people who are doing this despicable injustice to him? How could Jesus be asking forgiveness for those who are torturing him to the extreme, gambling over his last possessions? How could Jesus be saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do"? In a world that is so strong on revenge these days and weak on reconciliation, these words are not very popular. It's often been commentated, that people just seem to be so angry these days, and vengeance is what drives people. Injustice, personal injustice rather than injustice against others, sadly drives people. That is true, but I think we mustn't forget that in every generation it is true that revenge and anger and vengeance drive them. It is the mark of a fallen world. It is the mark of a world that's in rebellion against God, that is more concerned about revenge than reconciliation. And when something terrible happens and a Christian gets interviewed on the news and forgives his attackers or whatever, the world can't believe it. The world can't understand that. The world feels uncomfortable with it. You see it in our entertainment. We love the movies about vengeance. We love Rambo and Sylvester Stallone sorting out the bad guys. "I'll be back." We love that kind of stuff. We love to see that vengeance happen. The world can't handle somebody forgiving brutal executors doing such an injustice. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How could Jesus say that in the face of this kind of treatment? The world cannot understand it. And funny enough, lots of people in the Christian world couldn't understand that. Did you know that we've got about 5,500 ancient manuscripts that have been discovered of the New Testament, more than any other ancient manuscripts in the world? In some of the oldest ones that have been found, in some of the oldest ones, just a few of some of the oldest New Testament manuscripts that have been found, this verse is missing. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Some of the scribes who were copying the New Testament could not bring themselves to put that verse in Scripture. They could not believe it would be on the lips of Jesus at that moment. Left it out. How can the innocent forgive such brutal executors? Or should I say, how can he offer that forgiveness to such brutal executors? Because forgiveness offered is not necessarily forgiveness received. As a matter of fact, I want you to see secondly here that this forgiveness is rejected. It's entirely understandable, given that someone was being crucified in such a way. It's entirely understandable that somebody like that anyone could believe that somebody had the power to forgive anyone and save anyone, least of all himself. And you see this in the three mocking responses of people around the crucified Messiah. You see this in verse 35 with the Jewish rulers. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he's the Christ of God, the chosen one." It's mocking. They're not actually saying, "Oh, let's see if he'll save himself." They're mocking him. They're sneering at him. "Oh, let him save himself." The Roman soldiers are the same. Verse 36. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine and vinegar and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." Again, they're being sarcastic. It's mocking in verse 36. There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the king of the Jews." Even the sign is meant to be sarcastic. It's not like anyone really believed that. They didn't really believe he was the king of the Jews. It's a laughable insult to this dying man's claims. This is the Christ. This is the Christ. Look at him, pathetic, hanging on the cross, naked and beaten. This is the Christ, the king of the Jews. It's meant to be ironic. It's meant to be mocking. And by the way, it still is. It still is. It's one of the reasons why Jesus Christ is used as a blasphemous swear word today, because deep within the sinful heart there is a rejection in the darkness of our hearts to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Have you noticed nobody swears by using any other religious names? Nobody uses other religious names as a swear word. Nobody uses other gods as a swear word. But Jesus is said with some delicious delight on the lips of people. It's a verbal rejection of our crucified King. It's a blasphemy on many people's lips today, as it was on the lips of one of the thieves on the cross, verse 39. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him, literally blasphemies is the word. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Again, it's mocking, it's sarcasm, it's jeering, insulting, blasphemous, mocking the powerless Messiah, the crucified King of the Jews. And the whole picture of this 3 times mocking is to show how in the world's eyes it is so utterly ridiculous to believe that a crucified criminal has the power to forgive sin, has the power to save people from judgment. And yet, he does have that power. And the most unexpected person saw it. Not the Jewish leaders, not the theologians and religious leaders, not the soldiers, even the well-educated officers, except one near the end. Yeah, the most unexpected person saw it. So look thirdly and lastly at this picture of forgiveness received. Forgiveness received. It's the repentant thief on the cross who is only recorded here in Luke, who says one of the most memorable words at the crucifixion. Verse 39, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But, verse 40, the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Now here's the first surprise here. A convicted criminal who actually admits he's guilty. It doesn't happen very often. There was a guy in our church in Port Elizabeth who was very involved in prison ministry in PE. For many years, about 40 years, he had done prison ministry. Every week, going to the prisons, meeting with prisoners, counseling them, trying to help them, and sharing the gospel with them and discipling those who had come to the Lord. And he was telling us that one of the things that he hears most of all is that people come to him protesting their innocence. And they think that he's a pastor and he's going to help put in a good word for them, and they protest their innocence to him. He says one of the ways that you can tell that somebody's truly come to know Jesus and been saved is they admit their crimes. They admit their crimes. There's many who come and do the religious things and say, I believe, and they just protest their innocence all the time, trying to get him to put in a good word or help them get parole or whatever. But he says one of the signs, the main sign really, of someone who has truly come to faith in Jesus, they admit their sin. They admit their crime. They know they are guilty. Here, this man on the cross recognizes his own guilt, even in the face of the terrible execution he is getting. He says, we're getting what our crimes deserve. How incredible is that? Only the work of God in a person's heart can make you say that. Only the work of God in your heart can make you see the judgment that you deserve for your sin. Only God can show you that. And not only did this man see his own sin, his own crimes, and the fact that he deserved his punishment, but he also saw the sinlessness of Christ. You see what he says there? This man has done nothing wrong. This man has done nothing wrong. And in recognizing this dying man seeks perhaps more than he understands from Jesus at the time, verse 42. Then he said, verse 42, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Here is a cry for forgiveness in a way perhaps this man, the only way this man could articulate it, something, he knew Jesus could do something for him. And I'm sure he received probably more than he asked for, not only to be remembered, but to be forgiven and saved. And Jesus, verse 43, famously answers him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Today. And that's astounding. Today, on that day of all days, on that first Good Friday, as they're hanging on the cross, in the world's eyes, lost beyond all lostness, hopeless situation, in the cruelest of scenes, Jesus promises the man dying on the cross next to him, you're going to be with me today in paradise. The greatest of all promises on the worst of all days. That word paradise is from the Persian word garden, and it's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament for the Garden of Eden. You're coming back to the garden with me, says Jesus, today, forever. That's the fruit of forgiveness. That's the fruit of forgiveness. You're coming back to the place where God and his people live together in a blissful, sinless friendship for all eternity. That's what forgiveness secures for the one who sees their sin and turns to Jesus. And that is the difference between the two criminals. The one thief, like the Roman soldiers and the Jewish rulers, didn't see their guilt, didn't see their sin. And so they didn't see Jesus for who he really is. The other thief sees his crimes, sees his guilt, sees Jesus as innocent, sees Jesus as the one who could remember him in glory. And Jesus says, I tell you, you'll be with me in paradise. The words of forgiveness to a repentant sinner. And it is because of the cross that those words of forgiveness can be spoken. Spoken to those who recognize their sin and turn to Christ. And it is only those who recognize their guilt and turn to Jesus who will hear those words of forgiveness. In essence, what you're seeing here in this paragraph are two types of prayer behind these first two sayings of Jesus on the cross. For the unrepentant executors, for those who sneer and mock, Jesus' prayer is, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But essentially what Jesus is praying for the repentant thief on the cross is, Father, forgive him because he knows what he has done. See, there's the difference. Forgiveness is offered to all, but received only by those who know they are sinners and turn to Jesus in faith. And I wonder which one applies to you. Do you see your sin? Do you see that you deserve judgment for your rebellion against God? Well, Good Friday is a good day to say, Jesus, remember me.